Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Tabletopped, the podcast where we talk about storytelling, TTRPGs, and everything gaming. Today I have such a fun conversation for you, so informative. Michael Wohlfahrt is an amazing friend of mine that I met when I was in school, and we have worked on so many projects together. He's a filmmaker, he's a writer, he's just a great friend, and an avid TTRPG player himself. In this episode, we talk about storytelling, how to use a story circle, and just the do's and don'ts when it comes to writing a compelling story. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like and subscribe to the podcast, rate us, it helps a ton, and if you don't like it, send it to your worst enemy. That will still help the podcast. Everyone, buckle up. This is going to be a really fun episode. Hey, Michael. So, welcome to Tabletopped.
Thank you for having me on. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, Michael, we go back a long ways, back to like university days. Essentially, you came into my life as an improviser, but then I slowly realized that you were actually a writer, filmmaker, kind of philosopher type instead. And we've, continued to work together for, the past 10 years, working on vlogs. Nobody tried to find them. We have worked on short films. We've worked on books, plays, just like a bunch of different things, creative projects. So I thought there was no one better to talk to about story structure within games and TTRPGs and creating a story arc that is like coherent but also rewarding than you. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where the conversation takes us. I'll say that.
Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with TTRPGs and like what specific ones you have played in the past or which ones you prefer, or if there's none, then none, I guess?
I've played a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse stuff. I've played a bit of Fate. Ironically, I haven't really played that much D&D. I think I've only played like 2 or maybe 3 sessions, not campaigns, sessions, like ever of D&D. One of which I purposefully derailed right away. And another one that I had a lot of fun in, but it was also clear that it was sort of the DM's first time really doing it herself. So, but yeah, I played Numenera once. That was fun, which is like a D20 system, and a few other miscellaneous ones. Just sort of, played for a long time with a GM who was really interested in experimenting with systems. We rarely, if ever, played the same thing twice in a row. We kind of...
Interesting. Did you keep a same story going, or?
No. We did one campaign that was a sequel to another, and we did kind of do a reset back to using Dungeon World for that one. That was the first time that I'd ever played using Dungeon World.
Right.
But generally things were only connected in like a very broad and loose metaverse kind of way where
I love a metaverse.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the best, so I get the appeal there. What out of all of them, did you have a preference for any? Were there ones that felt better than others? Like, I don't want to put you on the spot for for anybody's preferences or get you into a flame war on Twitter or whatever. But do you have a specific one that you were like, this one's the best, I love it, get at me, kind of thing?
Ooh. I have fond memories mechanically from Numenera. That said, I don't think, gun to my head, I could actually describe how it works right now.
Okay,
It's
yeah,
been
that
a
makes
minute,
sense.
But I remember mechanically enjoying it once I kind of figured out how checks were sort of oriented in terms of like how challenging they were and the ways that you could, increase your own chances of passing them.
Right.
It kind of made lots of sense. I think Dungeon World is really fun and great and straightforward. I think 2d6 is a great just dice system to roll on. Statistically, I think narratively you want the like the sort of confidence that 2d6 gives you. You want to know that statistically the most common thing you're going to get is a 7, and that means you barely pass what you're trying to do, right?
Right, yeah.
So I really like that.
Which honestly is kind of like real life.
Yeah. You're probably going to barely make it through.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with you. I love Powered by the Apocalypse systems. Mostly because of the way it orients storytelling within it. In D&D, it feels a little bit more regimented in that there is a teller and a receiver of the story. So the DM prepares and tells you a story, and then the players are marionettes that sort of are inhabiting that story, and you can't really get too far away from the main storyline because the DM in the end sort of has a area that is prepared, and there are so many rules that if you go too far outside of it, it can be hard to maintain. I guess this is my personal experience with D&D, in that I find it very hard to run a game of D&D that I have not kind of created the invisible video game wall around to keep my players super dynamic within them, but also not going outside of them. And I think that Powered by the Apocalypse, because of the way it orients the storyteller as that, essentially it decentralizes power so that everybody can tell the story at any time, and the DM mostly has reactive power to sort of push people back on a road that they find more interesting, or give an obstacle if things are going too easily and there is something going on in the background, but you can really just completely ignore that, and like the world may end, but then a new story is being told outside of it, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, I agree.
So as a storyteller and a writer specifically now, so kind of zoning in on that, you've helped me drag different stories from my brain. And I actually remember during the pandemic, you were sort of my co-writer of a play that I wrote, but also you were helping me.
And you were my co-writer too.
Yeah, exactly. With a play you wrote, and also a book that you were writing, and all of the different projects that you had going, which was awesome. And one thing that I really thought was super valuable was like the way you visualized the arc of a story and the structure that you were able to put ideas through, and it kind of threshed them into something that was usable. So can you tell me a little bit about how, if you were a DM starting out a story or creating a story from scratch, how would you go about starting that?
I think one of the most important laws of storytelling, which, I say to be inflammatory, frankly, is that the shape, like the ideal shape for a story is a split circle.
Okay. It's
a circle with a horizontal line through it. Joseph Campbell puts the line kind of at 1/4, 1/3 of the way from the top to the bottom. Dan Harmon puts it right in the middle, but the core of stories is the concept of an overworld and an underworld, and that things begin in some way where they end. So if I were trying to set up something that I knew was going to change a lot depending on how the players chose to interact with it, I would still adhere very broadly to the sense that wherever these characters begin, it would be my responsibility to take them on a journey where the final part of the story was an echo or a reaction to that beginning, and that their story would be comprised of moments of comfort, the crossing of thresholds into conflict, and then the crossing of return thresholds back into comfort. I think that that's a really useful shape to keep in mind, not even for like the broad sense of what's my campaign going to be, but how is this session of a few hours that we're just going to do tonight going to be, to how is this encounter going to be?
Yeah, I think that that's like a really interesting point too, because at least in D&D, the way that the mechanics are structured is that it almost mechanically has that built into it, where usually you start a session from a place of just having had mechanically a long rest, right? And that is a moment of comfort and safety relative to other things you might get up to in the campaign. And then mechanically, you are driven to essentially use skill checks and RP that I would say is the crossing of the threshold into usually combat encounters, which are much more structured and have much more stakes attached to them, because your character's story could end at any time with one of those. And if you successfully make it through one of those, then you are then usually, if it's a hard encounter or whatever, you are stepping back through the threshold and into a short or long rest, which is, a moment of comfort or something like that. So I think that's like a really interesting cycle that you bring up.
Yeah. And you finish the encounter, you collect XP, you collect loot or gold or what have you. So in at least a sort of, at the minimum, your character changes in a mechanical or material way. Ideally, the really pivotal encounters will change your character in some sort of more meaningful way in terms of like their worldview or their outlook. And that's, I think, a goal to kind of aim for over the course of the entire campaign. Like these many nights you and your pals are going to be spending together. But it's a great anchor that almost I'm only saying that to cover my ass, because I presume actually probably every system has, a mechanical reward at the end of encounters like that, even if it's simple as, XP or your charges get refilled or whatnot.
Yeah, this has always been really interesting for me as well as a storyteller or somebody who is conscious of storytelling running one of these games, is that because the actor essentially is writing their own script along with it, is there a way that you think you can write a story or what are you looking for, paying attention for in a story when a character is talking, or the choices that they make that can kind of give you hints to what that change would look like eventually, or what you should start working towards long term? Because when you're writing your own story, you get to kind of make that decision wherever you want to. But in something that is a little bit more in development and changing as it's growing as well, is there little things that you can look out for within a story to kind of tip you off on how to do certain things?
That's the big one. As you say, like when you're dealing with like author-centric fiction, you get to decide these will be my character's flaws, and this is how they'll overcome them to become a better person at the end. But when you're dealing with tabletop RPGs, if a character's player doesn't kind of give you that story or that intention at the start, I think you're on thin ice, because what you're doing really when you're listening to the player speak isn't you're listening to what the character's flaws are, really. Yeah. You're treading dangerously close to trying to force your friend in the actual room to go through a overworld, underworld change sort of deal, which runs the risk of cleaning up your friends, maybe.
Well, no, it's interesting you say that, because I think that okay, so I've heard a couple of different things that really stuck with me on this subject that make me both really value the importance and the possibilities that these games allow us, and also it just speaks to what you said just now, where I've heard somebody say that the way memories work and imagination works is that if you spend let's say 100 hours playing a campaign in which you are trying to be a noble person and you do these great deeds with these people around you, and these characters are making these memories and are doing these tasks and building a history, that essentially the way the human mind works is that when you're on your deathbed and you're remembering back, the way the memory holds in your brain will not they will not distinguish the importance differently between something that's actually happened in your life and a story that you have either helped tell or you placed a lot of value in, so that those memories actually become somewhat equal, which is another way to kind of explain why some people remember things that have never happened to them. They remember it so clearly because they've told that story to themselves, they've bought into it, and then it has become part of their kind of their persona via memory.
Yeah.
And so these games offer us a really interesting, safe way to practice and to make ourselves experience and create memories doing the things that we want to enrich our true selves with. So if you are somebody who plays a character that really is trying to, uphold their most noble self, then that means you are practicing making those neural pathways, and you're actually making memories of yourself doing that. Which, all to say, is that I think that you really hit the nail on the head, where you're kind of psychologizing your friends as well when you're writing these stories for them. And it's just talking about it, it seems like it's an almost impossible task of making these things meaningful. But in a lot of the campaigns I've played, I've had these moments of genuine feeling where I felt an emotion that I took into my real life and still value in some way. Yeah, it's crazy, man.
I think that's absolutely the goal. I think that's like the point. I think that's to get kind of out there, maybe like the point of stories at their inception, right? But you don't necessarily tell the oral history of your tribe or whatnot just because it's bureaucracy. It's just recording history. You tell them because the experience of telling that story reinforces what you value, like what you've chosen as people to define your culture by. So it makes sense that there would be a degree of that in the playing out of these fantasy scenarios. But at the same time, it does run the risk of being a power fantasy, which isn't the same thing. Although,
it can still feel real good.
It can still feel real good, and the way the world is these days, broadly speaking and whatnot, they can feel similar.
Yeah.
It can feel like enshrining the ideal version of yourself, practicing nobility, like rehearsing those neural pathways of being a good person and being somebody who isn't trampled on, being somebody who asserts themselves before they can be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
I think that plays a big part in why you end up with campaigns that are murder hobos. Because, people's day-to-day life is they're being told something like, you should be able to live life on your own terms. You should be able to shape society to your will. But then they get out there and they try to participate in society, and it takes a lot more compromise than they ever imagined, and so they retreat into a fantasy that's like, what I really want to practice is not being beholden to anybody else and getting my own way 100% of the time, because whenever anybody says you can't do this, I murder them.
That's a real, I've never really thought about it that way, but it's definitely that. Like, it is definitely, that's where that desire comes from, because if you ever talk to any of the players after that happens, they will be like, well, it's just a game, or like, who cares? It's not real, or I would never do that in real life. But these stories that we're telling together, like I said, in a way, your memories are becoming. If we continue with the thing that I heard that one time that really stuck with me, I want to say, I think that's a perfectly great premise to have this conversation on. I think that's great. Yeah. No, I just think that when you have characters that are doing that, they are, for me, actually, I think that is a really great place to start a campaign from, because essentially when somebody brings their character out and they're just killing and they're doing that they are showing you an incredibly flawed character that if you want to tell a cool story around, like, they are giving you a lot of raw material, because then you can just say, okay, these are the way that these characters act, and they are willing to do so with the expectation that there are no consequences. And then you can make them learn lesson after lesson that is not the case. And then by the end, you are inherently going to have a different character, because they are going to have explored this pathway of, like, self, interest and disregard for others, because they are not real. I'm using finger quotes, great for audio medium.
Oh yeah, no. I think saying I'm doing finger quotes is even more powerful, to be honest.
Yeah, honestly, it's just I could feel all of the hairs on your body raise up when I said that. No, but I think that is giving you an opportunity to really put a mirror up to what those people are doing and give them a chance to change. You know what I mean?
I do. I do, and I think that's like an aspiration that I've held going into some of the campaigns I've played in the past, that, maybe those lessons will come across tragically to any of your listeners who aren't as acquainted with me as you are. I think, in the dynamic between the two of us, you're the optimist and I'm the pessimist. We should have maybe said that at the start.
Sure.
I think tragically, the way that most games, the method for interacting with the world is through I'm not going to pretend, because I'm well aware that there are other options available, especially in tabletop RPGs. But, we were talking about the sort of overworld, underworld of D&D. The battle system for D&D is almost like completely removed from the sort of going around town talking to people. There's a completely different mechanical set that you're allowed to engage with. And that's most players' goal when they start playing. They want to get to the combat encounter. So unless you're dealing with
I really hadn't thought. I had not thought about that as that it is. Even though there are skill checks and there are different things that you can do outside of combat, that most every episode, I guess, of an actual play podcast or a session of one of these games, the expectation going in is that there's going to be some form of violence inside of it at some point. I hadn't really clocked that until you just said it. That's probably pretty stupid of me, but...
No, I don't think so at all, because that's sort of something about story structure, right?
Yeah.
We expect that, and so it gets harder for us to detect how much of an ask it is for us as an audience to accept that that's sort of the default way that problems are resolved in, action movies, in a lot of novels, in video games, and tabletop RPGs aren't, generally speaking, an exception. We understand as humans, right, living with the modern history, the way it happened to unfold, that violence is a essential pillar of our social lives, our political lives, our sexual lives. We're aware of it, but because we don't want to ourselves be inflicted with it, we all mutually agree that we will try our best to not do it to each other.
Right.
So we need to construct these sort of fantasy arenas where we can touch on it, where we can see how it feels, where we can experience it with enough, removes that it's safe. And that's what games are. This is something that my, the GM who I had the most experience playing with said once, that, games are all practice for the real world.
Right.
And when we practice mentally reckoning with violence in a game, I think we're all hoping, we all would say when pressed, I would hope, that we don't ever expect or want to act on that practice.
Right.
And yet, as I say that, I also kind of know that it's not true.
Yeah.
That they, in the 90s, the US government modded Doom to use it as a training simulator for soldiers.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess it is an interesting... It is interesting. It kind of makes me want to run a campaign that is very like Undertale inspired, where you set violence as a easier outcome to things and then just let the players reckon with the consequences, and they are never good. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I think that is a really interesting way to approach a game. If you take something that is just essentially, that mechanic is just, hey, this is an easier way for you to get through this hard thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be, ripples that come out of that. But it is definitely the fastest, easiest, most trained way our brains think in how to resolve a situation. And it could be like really interesting to just...
Can I tell a funny anecdote?
Yeah, of course.
One of the systems we played was this game called Fellowship.
Yeah.
Do you know it?
No. Tell me about it, because I actually, part of my kind of hopes with starting the podcast and everything was to learn more games that are coming out and things, or that have come out and I have just no experience with. So tell me everything.
So I want to say, first of all, that, it's called Fellowship. It is right there in the name, acknowledging the degree to which the whole medium of tabletop RPGs kind of owes its lineage back to Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings.
Sure.
Which is fun. But essentially, the system hinges on the premise that the game master plays a character. They are the overlord. They are like the arch nemesis for the party. And they have their own set of, mechanical skills the way a player would. And their goal is to conquer and or destroy the world. There are like different classes of overlord you can be with different goals.
That actually sounds really dope.
It's strap in. It gets doper.
Yeah. Okay.
Because the mechanical goal and narrative goal of the hero party is not to level themselves up so much that they can single-handedly defeat the overlord. It is to build a fellowship of allies capable of defeating the overlord, who also, over the course of the campaign, gathers his own, like, thieves' gallery of lieutenants.
Dude, this is fucking dope. This is the best thing I've ever heard.
Fellowship was a very fun game that when I played it with the group of people who, I played mostly with at the time, did not understand at all.
Yeah.
And we kept on going to towns and making friends, and they'd be like, what do you want us to do now? And we'd say stuff like, why don't you stay here and guard the town in case anything bad happens? Because we're like, they're an NPC. We don't want them, harshing our groove.
Yeah, right.
We don't want them
we're the
bogging down our
heroes.
style. So this accumulated so we're going around, and every time we encounter the Overlord, he defeats us hands down.
Yeah.
He's attacking us with a party. We're 3 guys. It's him and like 4 other dudes, and we're like, what the heck? We're totally outnumbered by final boss fights all happening at once.
Yeah.
And the moment where stuff like really started to change for us, it wasn't a eureka moment. In hindsight, I think it was a really important moment for us that got us thinking. We were in this desert.
Yeah.
And there was this temple.
Okay.
Like these temple ruins, and they were guarded by a giant spider.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, we want to get into the temple. There's like an artifact or something. So we come up with this plan you run over here, cause a distraction. You go over here and use your mega strength to push over this pillar, and we'll kill the spider. We'll like start off this combat encounter with this really cool sneak attack.
Yeah.
So we go and we do it, and the guy pushes the pillar over, and the spider goes, "What?" And it crushes him and kills him instantly. And we're like, the spider could talk.
It was sentient. Oh, okay.
And that combat encounter was really easy.
Yeah.
And then it took us a while, but we were like, hey, could we have recruited that spider? And the GM was like, yes, you could have. That's what they were there for, actually.
Wow.
They were not hostile to you at all. They weren't I'm doing air quotes right now. They weren't guarding the temple. They were just kind of like standing around it.
That's so interesting and cool, though. That is what a way to just peel back the layers of bullshit that we place on top of ourselves, and then we show what's underneath, and we're like, uh-oh.
You want the kicker?
Sure.
You want like what makes this really spicy? I was playing a character who was a bug. Like I was like a humanoid bug, and so I really should have been more open to the idea that maybe another bug wasn't a bad guy.
You were a self-hating insect.
I had a lot of complex stuff wrapped up in that bug character. Yeah.
But also, talking about building interesting story moments, like that is fucking cool for 3 people to have a moment of realization of what did we just become? Because it kind of sounds like, honestly, Michael, that what happened through the course of this campaign is it turned out that the Overlord maybe wasn't such a bad guy. And these 3 monsters were just going from town to town, killing people and taking what they think they needed to become more powerful.
Because they looked at us funny or they were ugly. Right. We turned it around from there. But at the same time, I think we did also have to have that, but, in the same way that all evil villains do at the end. Like, have you ever thought that maybe it'll be good if I'm the, single authoritarian dictator of the entire world? There'll be no more crime.
Listen, this is a great point to DMs who are listening to this, writing their next story. Give that line of reasoning just a rest. If you want your big bad to have some like interesting thing to say to try to sway the players in the last moment, don't make it something that is so easy to be like, fuck you.
Yeah. And that's one of the, going back to what you were saying about, challenging not only characters' preconceptions, but maybe even players' preconceptions about practicing being better. We live in a world where there are a lot of powerful people who do terrible things every day and tell us that they're for our own good, and we believe them.
Yeah, right.
We don't need to create some like cartoonish villain who just says like, oh, if I killed everybody else, there'd be no one left to do crimes, because there are political systems at play in, listener, your backyard, probably, that the tabletop RPG, I think, is an excellent venue, excellent arena to like suss out alternatives to, and like really question and take our ideas about how things could be better and sort of, put them to the test, see if they stand up to these mechanical rule sets that have been created under a liberal system.
Yeah. And
say, can we make this work differently? Well, does it need to be about how much gold we get at the end? Do we need to kill everything?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that you say that, because there was a weird moment in my D&D campaign that I'm a player in, who I'm going to throw some brackets, open brackets. I'll come back to this thought in a second, but I will be 100% honest that my original character, Bill Stabums, was a way for me to express the feeling that like I didn't have a whole lot of agency in my life, and that I could, it was a way for me to just do whatever I wanted whenever I thought of it, and to then try to get out of those situations. And it led to him having a really, a bad reputation. I mean, the party was like, oh, Bill, but also Like, he was not able to go to certain towns because the last time he was there, he, like, jumped through the window of a tavern after starting a huge fight or whatever. Like, these are the things that happened. And now, 3 years into this campaign, I'm really wrestling, like, or I should say the character, but also me, I guess, is wrestling with the facts that they don't believe that to be the right thing to do anymore. And also, they are chained down by caring about other people just from the fact that I've played with all of these characters for 3 years, and it is way more interesting. All right, close brackets. Anyway, what I was saying is that in this game with Bill, we had found these warlords that were essentially, they were fighting endlessly, being revived and then fighting again because they lived for sort of like a Valhalla-esque fight, and they were continuing to do that. But in order to stop our kind of big bad, one of the lieutenants of the big bad had sort of infiltrated this and was slowly starting to gain influence within this cadre of warriors, and it was going to become like a problem in some way. And so we had to go in and lift this curse, I guess, was the way we kind of put it, of this rebirth and these people not being able to fight like that anymore because it was just not the way we couldn't deal with that if they became the army of the big bad or whatever. And then we sort of had to try to build like a democratic structure in which all these different factions had to come together with other factions we had met elsewhere. And we were trying to create some sort of stable government. And it was really hard. It was really hard. It's really hard. We got to the point where we were just creating, a Western democracy. And then people started to be like, well, what we live through right now kind of sucks. Maybe we should try to alter some of this to address some of the issues that we experience. And it became like 2 to 3 hours of that game was just us trying to nail out a constitution. It was really interesting. Amazing. Yeah.
That's amazing. I as a counterpoint to that was one of my sort of goals in this fellowship campaign. I saw myself as like a political activist sort of guy, so I would go to towns and we'd solve their problem, but the sort of systems and institutions that caused the problem would still be there. And this is not a dig on the other players in this campaign if they ever hear this, but that wasn't where anybody else's priorities lied in terms of the stories that they were interested in. So it just really came down to me saying, I set up a provisional government.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess we go to the next town.
Yeah, that's something that I here's a little story making advice that I would give to a new DM that's trying to tell their really cool story, is that if you are truly trying to make it a dynamic, interesting, character growth-based story, then make sure that you are giving, like I thought of it as episodes, essentially, but make sure you are giving everyone an episode in a rotational order, maybe, so that they can all develop the shit that they're interested in and the stories that they want to tell. Because if you get really invested in either your story as the DM or any individual stories within the party, then there are going to be people who feel like the day player on a sitcom or something that comes in for an episode, helps the main character, and then leaves. And that is a terrible feeling.
It's something I've circled in on outside of sort of the arena even of collaborative storytelling. I think it's, and this is, I am not an authority on the matter at all. So this is mostly a big old something I've pulled out of me old butt.
Me old butt. Yes, exactly. Okay, continue.
But I have this theory that like the protagonist theory of stories is wrong.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think stories are about protagonists. I think stories are about societies. I think that when you look at stories that like really impact people, that like gather these big fandoms, you know, big asterisks there, and they're like fandoms that don't come to regret ever being associated with the property after the airing of the final season.
Sure.
But when you look at these things that seem to have this like really big impact on people, yeah, generally there's like a point of view character.
Mm-hmm.
There's someone who we see as a hero, and they probably cause a lot of stuff in the story to happen, but it's meaningless if it's not happening in the society that the story's actually about. Yeah. And, you know, I think that if you think of that and you listen to the rest of Tabletopped podcast and pay attention to the episodes about Session Zero and listen to your players and what they're interested in and world building, and you establish a society that's worth inhabiting, that's worth paying attention to, then I think that those are ways to avoid falling into the protagonist trap, where despite the fact that there's this party of people, you know, sooner or later you're going to feel this compulsion to assign one of them protagonist.
Yeah.
And that the final confrontation is going to be kind of about one of them and their special power, and the others are going to have supporting roles.
Yeah,
I think if you step back away from that assumption that I think like the Western tradition, broadly speaking, asserts about stories and start thinking about them in terms of groups and societies, then I think you'll naturally pull towards being more curious about what the other players or characters want to do in that society, rather than zeroing in on one person who seems to be the most interesting.
Yeah, and I think that it can also make your society and the world that you've built more dynamic when you see how people want to interact with it too. Because like when I ran my Lakewood game, I would give each character an arc, essentially, or an episode within the arc to really put whatever... It was just the spotlight was on them, and we would kind of follow and see what they were up to. And what I found in the end was, if I put it through the lens that you just suggested, that what I found was that each of them was struggling with a different aspect of society, where... Jack, one of the characters who was sort of dropped in from a different plane and was like trying to do good, but also trying to figure out why he was there and how to eventually leave. In the end, he was given a chance to have a real family, like found family with these people. And then in the end chose to, you know, give up that feeling of finally being able to settle and be with these people, to go out and sacrifice that for the good of those people that he had put time and support and love into. And it did give him, it kind of placed him back in that story circle that you were talking about at the top. It kind of placed him back at the beginning, where he was in between these different worlds and was kind of awaiting his next adventure, but felt like a little further along that overarching adventure that wasn't really even addressed in the campaign. And then for another character who was a ghost and had been living in Lakewood for 50 years as an undead child, eventually she chose at the end of all this that it was time to move on, and it was time to not stay where she wasn't supposed to be anymore, and to accept that, you know, it might be scary, but there are times where you gather up the courage and you step into the unknown. And that was another part of the society that was examined by that character that I hadn't really intended, because it was a character that had been purely within that society her entire existence, essentially, and then chose to leave it behind because she knew that there was something else that she needed. So I think that that's a really interesting way of putting it, because you really only have control over the society in which your characters interact anyway. So by making it really dynamic and interesting, and letting them build those stories, I think that they kind of come out naturally if you build something interesting enough, and then you have a genuine interest in how people interact with it.
You know what I mean?
Tabletopped will be back right after this message. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've gotten really into wearing hats in the last few years. I just love them. They're really great accessories, and I've settled upon beanies as kind of my favorite. They go with any outfit. They're good in any type of weather. The only thing that I've really come up against is that I don't want to support huge corporations when I make my beanie purchases. I don't want to give my hard-earned money to Big Hat. Instead, what I would love to do is support an independent, small, woman-owned operation. And I finally found one for all of us to support. Daily Dose of Yarn is an Etsy shop where she creates custom handmade beanies. And she can put anything on these hats, any slogan, any character name. You can request all of it from her. Daily Dose of Yarn have made great products for me in the past, and I just really want everyone to be able to support them. Again, that's Daily Dose of Yarn, all one word, and you can find them on Instagram to take a look at their products and Etsy to order one of your own. As always, thank you so much to Daily Dose of Yarn for supporting the show.
I was watching a video essay of somebody responding to a game writer basically saying that, video game storytelling is like so poor that to be lauded as having like a good video game story, all you really need to have is a story. And it was, an interesting sort of overall thingamajig, but sooner or later they ended up talking about Disco Elysium, which for anybody who's played it, it's a video game, but it is obviously has so many of the trappings of tabletop RPGs. It's clearly like emergent out of that tradition. And I don't know if this was the video essayist quoting one of the Zone developers or if it was their own sort of addition to it, but it was great what they said. They said role-playing games aren't just about what's happening. They're about who it's happening to. And that's the really important thing that you need to set aside if you're going to be creating a world, scenario, campaign, whatever, as a dungeon master or a game master, that you only have control over like the events that will happen to people, and your players are in charge of who it happens to. And once you kind of see the division of labor like that, then you can set yourself to the work of creating a world that's ready to be reacted to.
Yes.
You can set people up so that like there's an obvious threshold that like they can cross. So there's something that they need to reckon with, but you might not even be able to necessarily define what their underworld on the other side of that is. Like the thing that happens, who it happens to, it might completely change what those consequences were. So, I'd err so far as to say that maybe preparing those things, they're less important than being aware of sort of the apparatus which motivates reactions in your world, rather than laying out specific plot points and specific challenges for characters. Because, as I gestured to earlier, there's sort of a dichotomy between characters and the players who play them, which is that a character's challenge is something the player is mechanically prepared for. They're looking for that specific challenge because they have a sheet in front of them that tells them how to beat it up.
But there's also like an interesting thing in what you just said as well about how you can use the mechanical trappings of a RPG in how to tell your story. In that what you just said is have an idea of what happens to who and how, essentially.
Yep.
But the way you describe situations and the way you dish out information to people can be your greatest hand in shaping a story as well. Because, for example, in a really basic situation, if you go into a room and you say, it is a cobblestone room, there's water dripping from the ceiling, it looks as though it has been left empty for a very long time, but you feel a strange air current in the room that is not present in the hall that you were just in. Like, just by saying that, you are directing them towards something. So you can use your power as a narrator and a storyteller outside of NPCs to really ask the characters to deal with a situation in a certain way, or to give hints at how the world deals with situations as well. Like, you could be in a castle and you say, like, oh, the court jester is, walking around, berating nobles and spitting on them and being really crass and rude. And then you see him go slightly too far, and a noble raises his hand, and like the king's knight goes over and chops off the guy's hand. And you can be like, oh, obviously in this society, the king has absolute power and can do, like, anyone associated with that power has like sway in the situations in which they are in. And then you can ask your characters and the stories that they are developing within themselves, how do you interact with that?
Yeah. Tolkien does this thing in Lord of the Rings. Whenever you move around, barring a few very specific examples, when you actually get to like follow Gandalf's perspective or whatnot, Lord of the Rings is told almost entirely from the perspective of the least knowledgeable character. Like, you're almost always with the hobbits, but if the hobbits aren't around, maybe you're with a dwarf who, is older and a bit wiser, but like purposefully ignorant in the way only a dwarf can be about like the political machinations of other cultures. And through that, Tolkien is able to educate the reader about the world, so much so that the psychological experience of reading Lord of the Rings is different from reading other books, because they never have to stop and like explain things at length outside of the voice of the text. You're in the point of view of someone who, whenever something important comes up, they're sheltered enough that they get to say, pardon me, what's that? And then someone can explain it to them. By default, unless you arrange things otherwise, your players are going to be in a similar situation. Your players are going to be people who are not necessarily outsiders to, the society as a whole, but they're people who are going to need new ideas explained to them.
Yeah.
They're people who are going to need introductions to ideas. And I think leaning into that, acknowledging that that's the case, I think that's a great recipe to not only facilitate what you were talking about, the ability of the dungeon master as a storyteller to sort of give hints towards mechanical solutions for specific problems, but to just make the experience of the world feel more like an experience and less like something that they were supposed to have researched, or something that blindsides them at like the worst possible moment, which is a mistake that I made a lot as a young player. I often wanted to insert myself deep into a society, make myself somebody who wasn't, if not important, at least like notable, somebody whose challenges would arise out of their social standing, and almost without fail, I would arrive at a situation where there was something that was just beyond my understanding or grasp as a player.
Yeah.
And I just feel this massive disconnect between myself and the fiction I was trying to partake in, because all of a sudden this character who I had sat in, the table talk sort of part of the game and declared was very knowledgeable and knew what was on the go, and then needed to stop the game and have something explained to me about how stuff was supposed to work, or, asked to backtrack that my character had just done something that made no social or political sense, because
This
I was unaware.
This is, I think, the biggest and hardest thing to deal with as a storyteller DM. Because I'm just going to also just say that some people, like you said earlier, just like to war game, and they like the mechanics of D&D or whatever TTRPG they're playing, and that's fun for them, and that is totally okay. This is like...
Of course.
We're specifically talking if you want to basically run a story that is not just a way to get from violent encounter to violent encounter.
We're definitely talking about like a very specific utilization of the medium, and one that diverges, I think, from what people's assumptions of it are.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to enter into a kind of understanding of TTRPGs that is a bit more sympathetic to what we're talking about, because you have things like Critical Role and the Adventure Zone, where people are telling very emotional and like rich stories with these systems. So I think that we're definitely getting there, but just that caveat aside, the biggest thing that I've run into over and over again, and there's really no way around it, whether I'm a player, whether I'm a DM or GM, is what you just said of the dissonance between a character knowing something or what a character should know and what a player knows or remembers from session to session, or any of that. And so is there any like storytelling tricks you can kind of spill out that would, if not solve, at least try to help ease the burden that causes? Because there's nothing worse when you are like, you come to a reveal and like a character pulls off a mask and is this other character or whatever, and people are like, who is that?
Yeah.
Did we talk to them a while ago? I don't remember. Because it is also a weird medium in which you can go months between having been knowledgeable of a certain point or thing within the story. So is there any sort of storytelling advice you can draw up to help smooth that over? No?
Nope. I can think of, as a player, like I can give mechanical and social recommendations. Sure. As a player, take notes. Find an excuse for why your player would take notes and in what form they would take notes. If they are a particularly brutish, violent person who perhaps, is subverbal, maybe just have them keep a mental log of people who they want to fight. keep it simple.
Yeah, right.
If they're a scholarly person, bring a notebook and write all of your notes as little journal diary entries. Because the dramatic weight of something like a reveal of something that the DM remembers because it's their world and they love it and they want you to remember it and engage with it the way, we engage with author-driven fiction. Explaining it or doing something in the story that makes it more understandable, I think, undermines the drama of the reveal.
Yeah, totally.
Speaking specifically to your example, there are, ways to remind people by having NPCs nearby who would be aware of certain things. But again, it's kind of on the player to have those conversations to be reminded in a way that would seem, subtle and not like, oh, a gnome runs up to you yelling that there's an enemy from 5 sessions ago in town.
Yeah, the thing that I'll sort of add in here as well, because I agree, the onus is not just on the DM to tell you a great story and hold your hand through it. You have to also put some effort in if you're actually going to tell a meaningful story. And so, like you said, taking an active part in maintaining the story's fiction by having your character or your player, write down and actively take the effort to, reread a recap, or I like to keep a wiki for my characters so that they can add or not, or just read about who different people are from session to session. But the other thing you can do solely as a storyteller is, if things matter, bring them up more. It's really simple. Like if there's a character you want them to know by the end, then you better have every few sessions have an interaction where they talk to them. And over the course of a few months, they are never going to forget that character, because either they are going to revile them, or they will hate them, or they will love them. Then you've kind of got your hooks into them, because then they are going to ask about and try to follow up on that plot hook, because again, being the narrator's voice is powerful in that if you can have them keep encountering someone or something that you want them to deal with, either thematically or an NPC or a monster or whatever it is, then they will remember it just from repetition. So that's the only way I was ever able to, make sure that my players got what I was trying to do, was that I'd be like, hey, this character says, wow, this is really interesting. It's probably related to this other thing that you just dealt with.
I think absolutely. I think the only downside to that is that you really only, I think, do that for a very focal element of the story.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So absolutely, right? If your goal is to make sure that you and the players are on the same page about a pressing, urgent element of your story, then absolutely, it should come up all the time, I think. It should be something that it makes sense for NPCs to comment on casually, in the way that people who you just talk to when you're waiting in a lobby or what have you, just kind of sort of comment on current events, or the weather, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Because you can make it into something really cool too, that if going back to what we were talking about earlier about violence and its use in these games, maybe you're playing a game where you're kind of examining that, and your characters kill a knight that was protecting a corrupt noble, but was fairly beloved by the surrounding population because they were a symbol of virtue and honesty in an otherwise corrupt system. And then they go to another town, and they overhear people are in the shop. They're like, did you hear that a group of bandits just killed Godric the Knight or whatever? And then another town over they hear, bandits are assailing our way of life. Didn't you hear they killed one of the noble's most virtuous soldiers or whatever? And then you can adapt it throughout their travels, and so that they are going to have to continue to deal with this thing that they did,
Yeah, I think having consequences outside of the mechanical is essential.
And also, I just want to add one more thing, because I think that what you just said is important about outside of the essential is really important, because if it never hampers their ability to do anything, nobody puts the pieces together that this party is the one that killed the virtuous knight, then they are still going to have to emotionally, and it's a way to get away from that, the structures that the game kind of places around you, by having them as human beings with emotions deal with the fact that people are talking about this deed that they did, and they have to either deal with the shame or the feeling of disquiet that people don't agree with them, or whatever it is that it brings out in them. They are going to have to deal with that, and that is a way to really drive home a non-essential part of your story as well.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is that it does what good interactive fiction has to do, which is blur the lines between mechanical and narrative. So you slay a knight of some renown, word gets around, eventually faces are put to names, you enter a town and the shopkeep won't do business with you. Is that a narrative consequence, or is that a mechanical consequence? Well, it's both. So if you have, going back to the ideas of societies, going back to the ideas of who events are happening to, as much as the players have the toolkit of like the move set in front of them to deal with problems. You have your world building book to think through those things and manifest emotional consequences as political and social consequences, which eventually then work their way into the mechanical system of the game. And once you get those things working, then yeah, you're capable of reminding people of things. I think, just to tag this before we move on, perhaps, that I think I might have hyper focused in on your example of like a surprise face reveal trying to answer this question,
like a Scooby-Doo moment. Yeah.
how do you remind somebody that you're about to surprise them? You don't do that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have found that most of the time the surprises do not work story-wise within the game, because you're not dealing with a character, because there's two very separate things here. One is that the characters are surprised. You can do that all you like. You can do that all the time. Oh my gosh.
I didn't expect that.
Yeah, or someone being like, what? My guildmaster that I have followed everything, that they're the one sending me on these corrupt whatevers. Like, that can happen, but most of the time the player has to sort of know what's going on, or will have figured it out before their character, and you just have to trust that the player isn't going to be min-maxy and stupid about that. To have a real cool story moment, you can have it with the player knowing and the character not. Surprising players, I've always found, has to happen within short-term bursts. Like, within a campaign, there are several arcs, and within every arc, there are small moments. Like you said, in that, I mean, we're going to talk about, to end off, I would love to talk about the story circle again that you were talking about, because that blown up to any size works really, really well. And if you shrink it down to within a session, you can surprise the hell out of your players by taking a small moment that's leading to a bigger moment that's leading to the actual moment that matters within the story, and using that as a surprise. So within one session, you can try to flip the script on them and have that cool moment. But if you're looking for a long-term reveal or whatever, I've never really found a whole lot of success there.
I think that trying to surprise people is a shortcut to what you really want to do, which is impress people.
Oh yeah, that's very yeah. No, I 100% agree with you.
Have you ever played this War of Mine?
No. Oh yes, I have. Yep.
Yeah. I'm raising my hands in defense. I don't care for this War of Mine. I think there's not enough, what I was just talking about, merging of the mechanical and the narrative. I think there are like two very clear levels on which things are happening. I think the gameplay is very frustrating and the story is very sad, but I don't think the gameplay is sad, which I think that game would have to be. And my thought on it is that nothing awesome ever happens.
Yeah.
That you're never being made to feel awesomely sad. You're never impressed by how sad the game made you feel. You simply recognize the human horror the game is aesthetically portraying, and then socially acknowledging, I have to say that that's sad, otherwise I'm a psycho. I need to be able to say, yes, stealing food from an old couple in a war zone is bad, and the fact that I did it means I'm bad. I'm sad now. But I don't think the game accomplishes that. And that's where this idea comes from for me, that when you're trying to surprise somebody, make somebody sad, make somebody excited, what you're really trying to do is just like impress them. So even if you're explaining stuff, even if they know something, if you pull it off, and I don't think there's advice to do this, I think it's either like you do it awesome or you don't. I think that's I think that's just, that comes with practice and rehearsal and confidence in your story and confidence in your own storytelling, the ability to do that. But if you give somebody something that follows like a perfect through line of logical consequence, if you give somebody a truly earned emotional payoff, they will have as intense an emotional reaction as if you did them a really big Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, no, I think that is pretty much... you got me stammering, because I think that is all together the most important thing that has been said in this conversation so far.
Cut it down to just that.
Yeah, I think that the title of this episode is going to be "Don't Surprise, Impress." I think that is really, really smart, because it allows you way more latitude in how you operate. It doesn't require you to try to like outsmart your player or anything. All you're doing is telling a really well thought out story with them, and if you do it while treating them as a active member of the story, then you will impress them. And I think that is... Because this reminds me, this isn't a TTRPG, but it's a really great game. Red Dead Redemption 2, I think, does this really, really well. Because at the beginning, story-wise, even if you want to play Arthur as a really virtuous person or whatever, the game mechanics fight you every single step of the way, because he is not a good person at the beginning. And by the end, it actually rewards you for doing nice things with really great story moments and really beautiful ways to get to know your character in a way that's really impressive and allows you to really feel the change that has happened in this person. And it is really impressive, and the game mechanics help you the whole way through, because it is not it's not telling you, it is allowing you to to be a part of it and experience the dissonance. If you're like, no, I'm a good person from the beginning and I'm doing all this good stuff, it's like, then why are you robbing a bank, you idiot? I think that's really smart.
The story circle.
Yeah, if we could... The way that I really want to end this conversation is, because you and I have both talked about the story circle a lot, I want you to break it down a little bit more in detail and give just like a quick example that you can either make up or pull from fiction, doesn't matter to me, just so people get an idea of how you can use it in your writing.
The cool thing about the story circle, like, as I said earlier, is that it scales. It can be... I think I would argue should be the shape of like your story on the most macro level and the most micro level, but the circle itself also scales in complexity. Like, you can find versions that map out Joseph Campbell's monomyth Hero with 1,000 Faces that have like 24, if not more, story beats around them, and some of them have like alternate versions where it's like, sometimes the beautiful lady is an old man. I don't know. I think there's also value in boiling it down to as simple as the split circle of overworld, underworld. But I think the most elegant version of it is Dan Harmon's Story Embryo, which, if you've ever just in like a moment of spiritual crisis frantically Googled, how do I write a story? It's probably come up. But essentially, it's a circle with the horizontal split I mentioned and a vertical split. And I would encourage anybody listening to draw this. I would encourage anybody listening to draw this at the start of anything that they write, just so that they can see the shape of it. I do that. I find it very anchoring. It gets you away from the whole like blank page thing. What's my first word? What's my first sentence? Doesn't matter. It's the story embryo. So there's 8 beats around it. There's you, need, go. And now we've passed into the underworld here. Search, find, take. And we're back around to the overworld. Return, change. So you, a character that the audience can relate to, you need something. So you go on a perilous journey. You search for it, you find it, and in taking it, you pay a price for it. And then you return back to the place you started, geographic, emotional, spiritual, what have you, but you've changed. So, like, this maps onto almost any story. I'll use, for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to use Star Wars. So you're Luke Skywalker. You're some guy, right? And your family gets totally murked by the stormtroopers, so you need to see justice done. You have the whole droids thing. You need to. Your material goal is to go find Princess Leia. That's what John York would call a want, a material immediate goal. There's a greater spiritual need in Luke Skywalker to do justice, learn the way of the Force like his father, understand his place in the universe. So he goes to Mos Eisley. He hires Han Solo, and they go out searching for Princess Leia. They find her, but in the process, when they take her away, the Empire tracks the Millennium Falcon to the Rebel base. They return back to a planet where Imperial rule is not absolute, but they're about to blow it up. And in order to defeat the Death Star, Luke has to use the Force. He needs to open himself up spiritually, and he has to change. So, ultimately, this process is a collaboration in a tabletop RPG between you and your player. If presuming I'm speaking with a DM here.
Yeah.
It's also a collaboration between you and your DM, player. But the good news is that this story resonates with people. People want this to happen. The premise of Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces is that the monomyth isn't proscriptive. It's not a structure that he's enforcing on stories or recommending this is how you write a story, but rather that it's descriptive, that it's emergent out of the storytelling practices of cultures all around the world. That where people go, they tell stories. And when they tell stories, eventually they take on the shape of the monomyth. The story embryo is just another version of that. That these stories speak to people on a level that goes all the way back to nonverbals sitting around a campfire.
I mean,
grunting,
yeah.
pointing.
Honestly, like, just you describing out what the story structure or the story circle was, with just the, need, take, all that kind of stuff, it creates like an emotional reaction in me, which I think is probably something psychologically strange, but also I think just shows the power that this structure has, and it doesn't have to be as simple as, like, your story doesn't require them always to go somewhere. The going can be, changing a mindset. It can be, whatever it is that requires movement of not just your physical form, but your kind of emotional and spiritual self. So it can be...
I'd argue that even when the go threshold, that's what they're kind of referred to, like the go threshold and the return threshold, that even when the go threshold does correspond with, like, physically leaving, it's more important that it is a change in the worldview. In Lord of the Rings, when the hobbits leave the Shire, they pause for a moment. And in the movies, Sam says, I believe it's Sam in the movies, says, if I take one step further, I'll be further away from home than I've ever been.
Yeah.
That's what the go threshold is about. Not in adventures, it's about physically going out, which I would also argue is an important part of like a human's maturation as a person.
Yeah.
Leaving, your parents' home, leaving your hometown, going out and finding your own place in the world. But even if it is entirely interior, that's the part that would be there anyway if you were physically going.
Right.
You'd have to brace yourself for the unknown to enter the underworld. So, yeah, so I agree absolutely with what you said, yeah.
Well, Michael, this was honestly, this will probably be the longest episode yet of Tabletopped, and I wish we could talk for another 2 hours just because this is like my favorite stuff to get into, how to tell a cool story, how to receive a story, and also just how to be a part of a story is just so rich. So I'm definitely we'll definitely hear from you again.
Oh, I got a whole bunch.
Yeah, I think that out of everything, people should remember, don't surprise, impress. The story circle is really important. And then if there are any other tidbits that you could get out of our ramblings, then God bless you. You're really doing a lot of work there. But I think that...
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, it's just so great. And also, Michael, is there anything that you would like to plug? Anything? Because I know that you are working on a bunch of different projects. I know a lot of them are in progress, so maybe it's not the time. We can have you back on when it's closer to. But is there anything you want to plug?
No.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on Tabletop, Michael, and we'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
All right, everyone, that's the episode. Thank you so much to Michael for coming on today. I had such a blast talking to him. I always do when we talk about storytelling, so you're probably going to hear from him lots more in the future. If you have anything specific you want to have us talk about, whether it be storytelling or game mechanics, please send us an email at tabletoppodcast@gmail.com or send us a DM at Tabletopped on Twitter. We do check these things and we'd love to answer your questions on the show. If you're looking to support the podcast, please tell your friends about it. Start sending it to people that you like. If you hate an episode, send it to somebody you hate. Either way, it really helps us in the show. And if you could leave a review, like, and subscribe on whatever podcast app you're using, that helps in a huge amount during this early phase of the podcast because, we're new. So thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next week for a bonus episode of Tabletopped.